Hey everyone, welcome back to part 3 of this tutorial series on how to build real business systems without code using visual development. In this video we're going to be looking at how we connect to our backend using Xano. We're going to be taking a high level look on how we would do it, and then we'll delve into Xano and put it into practice, just giving ourselves a little bit of a primer into using Xano's API and its database. So let's jump in. So let's start by taking a high level look at how we can connect to our backend, our Xano backend. So as we covered last time, our front end makes a request to the backend by calling an API. And the backend essentially makes the APIs available that it wants to give access to. Not just to the front end, but it could be to other systems or the back end systems. Now, when we refer to a back end making an API available, the phrase that we actually use is it exposes an API. So if you like, an API that's on the left is those that the back end has exposed to the outside world, whether that's a front end or to another system, another back end. Okay. Now, when we're talking about APIs, we are generally referring to what we call REST APIs, or sometimes they're called RESTful APIs. Now, all of that means, if you ever come across this, and you probably will during the course of this tutorial and you're wondering what it is, all it means is it's the type of API that has been exposed. And effectively, REST APIs are just a type of API that the industry is effectively standardized on over the last decade or so. And it's just so that every system can talk to other systems, knowing that there's a standardized type of API to call. Again, don't worry about it. You don't even know what it needs to stand for. It's just a matter of that if you see it, you know what it is. Okay. Now, when we talk about an API that's been exposed by the back end, we often refer to that as an endpoint. So sometimes we'll call it an API, sometimes we'll call it an endpoint, sometimes we'll even call it an API endpoint, okay? But you will see the phrase or the term or the word endpoint a lot, and just so you know what it means, it's just another word for an API. And the way to think about endpoints is that the back end sort of has these little spikes that it sticks out, that it exposes, that it makes available, and that another system, in our case our own front end, can plug into that particular spike that's left sticking out, effectively, that's exposed as an endpoint. That's probably an easier way to think about it. So one of the most common types of endpoints that a backend exposes is the ability to log in. So if you imagine how that would work, is that on our front end we're going to have a login form where the user can type in their email and password, and then they click the login button and it makes a request to that particular endpoint to log them in and to validate their details, or what we call authenticate their details. Okay, so in Xano we have a endpoint called login. So in the form, when the login button is clicked, it makes a request to the endpoint called login on Xano. So obviously, to be able to authenticate that user with the back end, we need to pass it the email and the password that they've actually entered into that form. We need to give it those details. And so the login endpoint has what we call inputs. So it knows that it's going to receive some information as an input, and then it can use that to carry out the task that's been requested. So in this case, we're going to give it the email and the password that the user typed in the form as an input to the login endpoint. The login endpoint is then going to do whatever it needs to do. The front end has no idea, to be able to authenticate that user. And once it's done its job, it will then return a response, and it will return that it's either successfully logged them in or that it has failed to log them in. And then when the front end has got that response back, then it can display a message on there, you've logged in successfully or login has failed, depending on the response that it gets back. So that's effectively how we connect to Xano's backend. Now let's see how that works in practice. Let's jump into Xano. So here we are in our Xano dashboard. Now it may look a little bit different to yours depending on whether this is the first time you've logged in or not, but essentially you'll get to this point. But it doesn't matter, we're more interested in these options on the left hand side. And the one that we're interested in is this option here, which is for API. Okay, and we get what we call API groups, which are essentially folders to organize your endpoints. Notice we're starting to see the phraseology come up, which is why I made sure I explained it up front. So groups is just a way that Xano helps you organize your different endpoints. So the one we're interested in is this authentication group. So let's click on this. Okay, and we're interested in the auth section because it gives us quite a few things. If you can't see it right away, just click on this auth tag here, and that will jump to the auth endpoints. We're not interested in any of the others at the minute. We're just interested in the auth login, the auth me, and the auth sign up. And primarily for this video, we're interested in the auth login. Okay, so we don't actually really need to know what's going on behind the scenes. However, let's take a look behind the curtain anyway. So if we click on it, and this is what we call the stack. This is Xano's function stack. And it's split into 3 sections. If I just close these sections up, basically it's split into inputs. We mentioned that just a moment ago. Essentially, it expects to receive an email and a password. They're the inputs that this endpoint is expecting to receive. Then we've got the function stack, and these are the steps that are going to happen in order for the process of authenticating to proceed. Now, don't worry about that at the minute. It's all rebuilt in for us. We don't need to touch it at all. And then we've got the response, which is what is going to get passed back into the front end for the front end to then deal with. Now, the great thing about Xano is that we can run it straight from here. So we've got this big blue run button in the top right. So if we click that, it's going to ask us for the email and password, exactly as it asks us for the input. So essentially, because we're not running it from anywhere, we're running it from within the Xano web app, then it means that we've got to put these in manually. So let's put some test information in. Let's say abc123@test.com, and the password is going to be please let me in. Okay, so when we're ready to run that, we can click this button at the bottom for run, obviously. Okay, and what we're going to get is a response with a exclamation mark in a red circle, and the result is going to be a code of error code access denied, message invalid credentials. So obviously we just put in a random email and password, it's not going to log us in. Okay, so that's essentially the response that we're getting, and that's what the response that the front end would get for it to deal with. Now, the key question here is, how did it know that we're not a valid user? How did it know that that wasn't a valid email to log us in with? It must have a place where it is storing the data of the users in order to be able to say, I don't have that user's email on record. And if we come over here to the very first step of this function stack, we've got a visual step that says get record from user, and it says get the user record via email. So essentially what that's doing there, it's going to do a search on something called user to get a record to see if its email matches the email that we've passed in as the input. In our case, this ABC123 test email. So what exactly is user? Well, as we discussed previously, the 2 obligations that a backend has is to provide an API, which is exactly what is going on here, but also the database. So the user is some type of data in Xano's database. So if we come over here to the left to this icon here, that's for database. Okay, now Xano has created us some default tables. I'm going to ignore these because they're not relevant at this point, but we do have a user table, and that's exactly what it was searching for here, to see if it could find a record that had an email that was the same as the email that we passed in as an input. Now, if you're wondering what a table is, think of a table as a spreadsheet with rows and columns. In database terminology, we tend to call the columns fields and we tend to call the rows records. But besides that, it's exactly the same. In fact, if we click into this, we'll just see that we get the table structure here. Initially, there'll be no records in. Now, because I've been in here before, I don't get Xano's database assistant. So we click on this button here, this will pop out, and probably if this is the first time you've used Xano to do this, this will pop out. Don't worry, this is seeing if we want to do anything with AI. We don't at this point. Okay, so what we can do then is create ourselves a default user, or just any user. So let's click add a new record, and I'm just going to put in my details, and I'll put the same information in so that we don't have to type it in again. So I'll just put abc123 at test.com, and I'll use the same password as well. Please let me in. Now, normally you wouldn't create users like this. You would sign them up from the front end, so this wouldn't normally take place. Okay, these fields are additional that is created for us. We don't need to use those at this stage. So now we've got our user set up and created with our email password. Let's go back to API, into the authentication group, into the login API, and again we'll do run. We've got our details, and now if we run this, our response is now giving us the tick in the green circle, and the result is a success. Huzzah! Now the response it's giving us is what we call an auth token. Now we're not going to go into this just now. Just remember the name, auth token. You certainly don't need to know about any of this. This is just a very cryptic piece of information that is very important later on, and we'll cover it later on, but you don't need to know it. I don't know what this means, and I've been doing this a long time. There are people that do know what it means, and if you really want to waste your evenings in the future, you can do some research in exactly what this means. It does mean something. It's irrelevant to what you need to do to build a business system. The only thing that you need to take from this is the phrase of auth token. Okay, what Xano also returns to us in this API is the user ID. That was simply the ID of the user record that we created. Okay, so that gives us a response of success. Now if we look at the stack, exactly what's going on here, just to give us an idea of exactly how Xano works. We don't need to understand it, but that's just sort of seed the information that we can use in the future. So we're going to get a record from user. It's going to try and find a user it's going to find a record in the user table where the email matches what we've passed in. Okay, this precondition is just to say, did you find a user? We did, so we can carry on. Then it's going to validate the password. Now, the password isn't stored as standard text, so it needs to do a special task of validating the password. We don't need to worry about it. Xano does it for us. Again, the precondition is just to say, did that password validate? Okay, and then we create an authentication token. It puts it in a piece of information called auth token, and then in the response, it then returns that to as part of the response to whichever system is calling it. In this case, it was just actually using Xano's front-end website when we click run, and then it's returned that response back to us. So effectively, we have now connected to Xano's backend, and we've also connected it from a front end. In this case, this is Xano's web front end. So we've already connected it. Now, obviously, this isn't what we want to do. We want to build our own front end in Nordcraft to be able to run this and deal with it itself. And obviously, we'll provide a much nicer user interface than what Xano has done. Its purpose is to show us exactly what is going on with that particular API. So that gives you a little bit of an introduction into Xano's APIs, a little bit of a glimpse into its database. In the next video, we'll be going into how to create our own login form from Nordcraft so that we can then call this API and then we can build our own authentication from our own front-end app. So thanks for sticking with me, thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me for the next one. Just before we go, just let me remind you about the link in the description where you can sign up to a waitlist for upcoming courses where I go into more intermediate and advanced subjects. With that said, see you in the next one.